Okay, welcome everyone. Now let's pull up our final project. And actually for this, the folks in 201 are actually, you are done your final paper. Now, obviously you're not actually done your final draft of your final paper, but between your 3 milestones, you have covered all of the critical elements of your final paper. So we're going to spend most of our time today talking about the rubric instead of going over the elements in the guide, since you won't be doing any writing from scratch. Mostly you'll just be editing based on the feedback you received from your instructor and based on the new rubric element requirements. So that is where we're going to focus tonight. And we might not need our whole half hour together, and that's fine, but feel free to ask any questions you have. Now's your chance. Okay, let's see if this is the right file. It is. Very good. Okay. So I'm going to scroll up to the top. Now we've looked at this before, and hopefully you've all looked at it on your own before. But we did cover it a little bit in our first milestone video, if any of you were able to join or watch that recording. We just wanted to talk about previewing what was going to be coming in week 7, and now here we are in week 7. So as you know, we have our overview of the project, which you should all be familiar with, in the prompt. And then the outline, which is basically what the guide goes through. So the guide goes through this outline and explains the expectations and approach for you as a writer for each of these elements. And this is how you will be, this is what you're graded on, each of these elements that you see listed here. And then this document breaks out the milestones. So you've completed milestones 1, 2, and 3, hopefully, all 3 of them, and should have received feedback on all of them by now. And then we get into the rubric. So what I did mention in that first milestone is that the rubrics for the milestones are going to look a little bit different than the rubrics for the final project. So the only difference is that you'll notice we have all the way to the left, we have an exemplary column that did not exist in the milestone rubric. Now what this means is that there's a higher expectation here to get full credit, to get 100% on any one given element. Now the bars just moved a little bit up. So you've had time to revise, you've hopefully learned a little bit more as you've gone through the exercise and been in class for 7 weeks. You've gotten feedback from your instructor that you can incorporate. So given all that, we have these slightly higher expectations about how to do a really good job. Now, this is something you might have heard me say before. The guide that we walk through in these webinars does have this exemplary column in mind. So it is guiding you towards that, even when you were just writing the milestones. And there's a very good chance that a lot of you are already at the exemplary level, even from your milestone. But it's an important exercise to go through this and see, look at your work, look at your feedback, and see how it compares to this new bar, if your goal is to reach exemplary on any of these critical elements. Okay, so the point difference is going to be the main thing you'll notice probably as students. I know that that's important to you. Obviously, we're looking at performance just based on the descriptors here, but they do correlate to a point value. So that's another thing I want to point out so you don't get any sort of shock. If you make no changes from your milestones, and let's say you got all needs improvement on all of your milestones, that was worth 75%. That was considered C work for a milestone. And you would have gotten 75% across the board. If you submit that exact same work that was graded as a C, it needs improvement, and you submit it as your final project, you'll notice here on the rubric that the values are different. The descriptors are the same for needs improvement, but the value is now 55%. So that work that you submitted and got a C on as a milestone, if you make no changes, no improvements whatsoever, that will be a 55% work, which is a failing grade. So I don't want any of you to do that. Certainly not across the board. So anywhere where you have a needs improvement, it will be worth fewer points. And the same thing for proficient. So let's say you earned a proficient on a critical element from your milestone, and your instructor says you've done a good job, you've earned proficient here, This is what I'd like to see you improve for the final draft. They're trying to get you to move from proficient to exemplary. That's what that feedback is for, even though you got a full score, because on the milestone, proficient was worth 100%. But you'll notice here, it's only worth 85%. So if you don't take your instructor's feedback and incorporate it into your revised final draft, you might stay at that proficient level, not move up to exemplary, and end up with 85% score on that critical element instead of 100% score. So that's just some ways to think about the grading. So if you had about, let's say, a B on your milestones and you don't make any changes, that might end up translating into about a C, depending on how it shakes out with the different elements on your final draft. So the point being that it's really important for you to make these changes, not only just so you have a more polished product, something that you can feel really good about and be proud about, but also so that you don't lose out on points, because the expectation is that you will have made those changes. All right, so since we don't have anything new to cover, I like to highlight a couple of critical elements where I find that students either often miss what they need to do to go from proficient to exemplary, or where I find that it's pretty simple, and so it's an easy way for you to make sure, okay, I can pick up these points, so to speak, or I can make this adjustment. It's very straightforward, and I can go ahead and do that for my final draft. So we're going to go over a handful of them, just that I know from experience is helpful to go over for students. If you have one that you would like me to talk about in particular, please just say so in the chat, and that's fine. All right, Latruma says there's an echo. Is it any better? Okay. All right, so maybe it's just some devices than others. Okay, I want to make sure that everyone's able to understand me. All right, so the first critical element that I want to highlight in particular is actually the first one listed, which is introduction purpose. Now, the reason that this is really important for you to pay close attention to in terms of your revision is because when you first wrote your milestone 1, and if a lot of you were in this webinar, you remember us talking about it a lot, is that it was maybe a little bit challenging to write the purpose of a paper and basically what would be considered your thesis statement before you've done all your research. The reason that you're able to do it at all is because you have the paper outlined for you. You're not creating your own outline. So the paper is outlined for you, so you can use that to describe your purpose. But at that point, because you hadn't done any research about your industry, you might not have been able to add in a lot of detail, and you certainly wouldn't know your conclusions. So now is the time where you can go back into that introduction and add a little bit more detail, things that are specific to your industry, specific to your company, and that sort of point to what your conclusions are going to be that you're going to build up to throughout your paper. So it could be something as simple as, if you did Starbucks and you wanted to talk about them, maybe in the end, you've written your paper and some of your conclusions are up a particular new product that you think that they should offer, locations that they should expand into, maybe changing the hours that they're open. I'm just spitballing some ideas, but if those are some of the things that you talked about, you might bring those up very, very briefly in your purpose. Talk about how you're going to use your microeconomic analysis to come to those conclusions, and then talk about Starbucks as a company. You say, in the coffee house space, instead of just using the very generic language of, we will look at supply and demand. You might say, we will look at supply and demand for Starbucks coffee, or we will look at price elasticity and demand of Starbucks coffee. You can bring in some more specifics there to talk about the market overall in your firm, and it will make it sound much richer than it probably did at the beginning when it was maybe a bit more vague. Excuse me, I'm just taking some water. So Patsy asks, if there's something new happening in the news regarding the company chosen, can we reference this at the end of the paper? Patsy, my advice to you, and maybe we'll talk about this a little bit as I scroll down going through the elements, unless you're going to go back and make that piece of news relevant to your analysis, I wouldn't try to add it. If you feel that it's relevant to the analysis that you did, then absolutely. Like the example I gave about Starbucks opening more locations, if you saw some news that they're planning to open 25 more locations, then maybe you could work it in. But everything that you put in at the end, which is your recommendations for the company, really needs to fit in with your analysis. So if it's something totally unrelated that you can't work into the work you've already done, you either have to go back and work it into your analysis or just leave it out altogether. So that would be my advice to you, to see how it fits in with the rest of your paper. All right. So that's the first one where I think it would be pretty straightforward for anybody who's already at proficient to move to exemplary by just adding in what you already know now that you've written your paper and you've developed a lot of expertise on your company. All right. So the next one I want to highlight is in the detailed is conditions impact. So you'll see that to get exemplary here, you need to meet the proficient criteria and explain in detail reasons for the trend. So this is one that students often miss because they might go into a lot of detail about the trends that they see. So if I stick with the Starbucks example, and these aren't real things that I'm saying, I'm not giving away answers about Starbucks. I don't actually know. I'm just giving hypotheticals. But let's say that people are really into cold brew, and they just talk about more people want cold brew, and cold brew is selling more, and so now Starbucks is selling cold brew. But why? That's the part that's going to get you to exemplary, is going into detail for the reasons for that trend. Why has that preference changed? What is it about cold brew that people think is better? What's the reason? Or if there's some change that, oh, well, people are demanding more tea, or people are demanding more food choices there. What are the reasons for those trends? It could be something like incomes have gone up, so people are looking for higher quality choices, or people are spending more at Starbucks because their incomes have gone up, and so now they want to buy food there in addition to coffee. Again, these are just ideas. So you can look at the trends that you've discussed and make sure that you're explaining why those trends have moved that way, and that will get you from proficient to exemplary. So you've already done the bulk of the work, you're just taking it that one step further. All right, so that's that one. Another one that I want to point out in particular is price elasticity of demand analyze. And sorry, let me just get it here. So it's right here at the bottom of this page that's sort of on top. So it's kind of right in the middle of our screen. And so if you read the proficient column, the proficient column says analyzes the available data and information and justifies how the price elasticity of demand for the firm's product was determined. So basically you're saying here, I think that price elasticity of demand is either elastic or inelastic. These are some of the reasons why. So you've given some reasons why, and maybe you've already used specific research to justify those reasons. But if you haven't, go and see what you can find in terms of economic research, and that's going to move you up to the exemplary column if you're already at proficient. So if you already reached proficient, but you haven't used economic research to help justify your answer, that's what you can use to bump yourself up. Now, the good news is that there's lots of, for almost all of the products and services on our suggested list, and most of the ones that people pick that even aren't on the list, there is some research out there. Now, there wouldn't be research necessarily for maybe Starbucks coffee, but there would be research on price elasticity of demand for coffee. And there might not be, actually I think there is, but let's say there's not price elasticity of demand information or research on Ford automobiles, but there would be for automobiles in general. So those are the kinds of things that you can incorporate and help explain why you think demand is either elastic, price inelastic, or price elastic. So that's another easy one if you haven't already included it. Patsy, I would say, yeah, milestone 2 is challenging, especially the price elasticity of demand section. I think students struggle, so which is why I kind of want to go over those a little bit more here to help out. So this suggestion with the research is certainly a step for that. And even if you weren't, like let's say for this element that we just discussed, price elasticity of demand analyze, if you were at needs improvement, getting that research will probably help you get to proficient and maybe even go all the way up to exemplary, because that's sort of a stepping stone that underlies the entire thing in explaining your justification. So hopefully that helps. The second one, the second price elasticity element is also one I want to mention or highlight in particular here. So you'll notice that in the proficient category or descriptor, it says explains the factors that affect consumer responsiveness to price changes for the product using the concept of price elasticity of demand as a guide. So there's our textbook outlines 5 different factors that affect price elasticity of demand. And so to get exemplary, it asks you to review all 5 of those factors. So a lot of times students will focus on a couple of the most relevant determinants of price elasticity of demand on the milestone, and they do a good job of it and they earn proficient. So if you know, or if you go back and review your work and you see that you only talked about 2 out of the 5 or 3 out of the 5, let's say, just make sure to go back and include the others to get full credit here. All right. Now another one that I want to highlight in particular, let's see how much time we have. Okay, we're doing pretty good on time, is the market share one. So this one, to get exemplary, it's asking you to present the data graphically and over time. So it's common that students will do one of 2 things. They might show a pie chart of market share. So you've got your company and their top competitors, and you use a pie chart, which makes perfect sense, to show the breakdown of each company's share. But you'll notice that the exemplary column asks you to show the data graphically, which you've done, and over time. So if you just give us one snapshot of that data in, let's say, year 2016, without any context, we don't know if that has been, let's say for your firm, have they been increasing that piece of the pie? Have they been decreasing their share of the pie? Has it stayed the same, but the pie is increasing? So those are some of the things that that we're looking for when we ask to see it over time. We want to see how their share is changing. So make sure that you satisfy both of those to get to exemplary on that critical element. So Jim, obviously the more years you can get, the better. Something like the auto industry is very easy to get annual data on market share because it's just very well researched. It's going to be maybe more difficult in other industries. So if you can get 2, you can at least show a movement. So if you give me 2016 and 2014, I can see a trajectory perhaps, or even if it was 2015 and 2016. So at least 2 years, but if the data is out there and your instructor sort of knows that it's out there, like I said, like for the auto industry or for the airline industry, that's another easy one. It might be nice to show a handful of years to really show if the trend is staying steady in one direction or another. Okay, so if you already have a 5-year trend and you've shown it graphically, you're all set for exemplary. And hopefully, as long as you met all the other requirements for proficient, but hopefully that's the feedback that you already received from your instructor. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and I do want to stress that there are some industries where it might be more difficult to find such easy numbers. So if you're having a really hard time if you're having a difficult time, this is one of the questions where you go to the Shapiro Library if you can't find it on your own, because they can get like industry reports that are often behind paywalls, or you'd have to buy a subscription to this special market research company, but they have access to a lot of that stuff, so they can help you get it. So market share is definitely one that can be a big help with the librarians at Shapiro Library, so ask them for a hand. And if you're still struggling, you can always just let your instructor know that you're having trouble finding a second year of data. And a lot of the times, because they've seen these papers, or they've just, we've been doing this for a while, so we know where to look for these things, they might be able to point you in the right direction too. All right. So the next one I want to talk about comes right after market share, and that's overall market barriers to entry. So when you discuss the barriers to entry, they're like the determinants of price elasticity of demand. They're sort of listed out pretty clearly in our textbook, and maybe you go through each of those and talk about, okay, well, this barrier doesn't really play much of a role in this industry, and this barrier is high in this industry. You go through those, and maybe you do a really good job, and you think, man, I really nailed it. But if you look at the exemplary column here, it's very specific in how to get to exemplary. It's not just doing a phenomenal job on analyzing the barriers to entry. To get exemplary on this critical element, you need to provide specific examples of a successful or failed entrant into the market. So if you were talking about Nike, you might say Under Armour was a successful entrant into the market. Or I'm trying to think of a failed one. I can't think of a failed one off the top of my head. But let's say you're doing some research and you find out, oh, there's this company that tried to break into the market and it just did not go well. I know regionally, like Krispy Kreme tried to break in here as sort of like a donut shop, and it didn't go well. I mean, they're still a company, but they weren't able to compete here regionally. So if you can find a story like that, and then discuss why they were successful, if they were successful, how were they able to overcome the barriers? Or if they failed, how did the barriers play a role in their failure? Then that's what's going to get you to exemplary. Yeah, the DeLorean or that was a failed one. I don't know if a whole company failed, but yeah, I mean, sometimes it's harder to think of failed companies because we forget about them. It's easier to think of successful ones, but either will satisfy this element. So. I see a few people typing, so I want to make sure there aren't any more questions before we move on. Okay, yeah, Shay, I've never heard of Stefan Marbury sneakers, but I'm assuming that's a failure, and that's why I haven't heard of it. Yes, exactly. Or I feel like there was this. It was it the Beats, the headphones? Didn't they also try to make like a competitor with iTunes for like music downloads, and that was a total failure? Am I remembering that right? That might be an example. So, I mean, not I don't know how many people are doing Apple or looking at iTunes specifically, but so they're out there. We just offhand don't know about them, but once you get to researching about an industry, then you get to know them a little bit better. Okay. So we've got a couple minutes left. And I just want to see if there's anything else in particular that I want to highlight for you guys. That's not just kind of general, going into a little bit more detail. And I think those are the only ones. The rest, you'll notice, are just really asking for, give a specific example, or go into more detail about the examples that you've already given. So you'll notice that kind of throughout the rest of them. It's not something really different or necessarily very specific, but just asking you to go a little deeper into maybe what you've already got. So between reading your work, reading your feedback, reading the rubric carefully, you should be able to place yourself where you are currently and what you need to do to move upward on the rubric, depending on where you think you currently have landed. So Susanna asks, the sample milestone, was it exemplary? Susanna, are you referring to the paper on Hershey? Because that was the entire paper. It wasn't just one milestone. So I wanted to just make sure we're talking about the same thing. Okay. Yes, that I'm not going to say it was exemplary on every single critical element, but it was a paper that I think earned an A. So it was from, I think it was from one of the first terms we started with this assignment. So, but really that's more of a guide for you to get a feel for what the paper, how it should flow, how it should sound, kind of ideas of what the student did. But please don't let that be the be all end all of your approach. The really important thing is that you follow the rubric and that you follow your instructor's feedback in that order. The rubric is how you're graded, and your instructor, not that their feedback is of course very important, but if you see something in the rubric that you need to do that your instructor didn't specifically say you needed to do, you should still be doing it. So that's why I say rubric first. Oh yeah, I forgot about all those old airlines. Those are good failed ones. But they were successful for a while, so I don't know if I'd call them failed entrants. So I guess when I think of that element, I think of a company that's trying to break into the market, goes for it, and just totally fails, just crashes and burns. Yeah, Jim, I'm glad to hear that. And it's a good habit to get into, to reading the rubric. I mean, it should be your first stop every single time you're thinking about the assignment, because it's the expectations and it's how you're going to be assessed. Also, this is, while not every single class here at SNU has these more detailed, longer rubrics like this class, they all use rubrics. So if you are always in the habit of, okay, I'm going through my writing, I'm going through my revisions, how does my work compare to the rubric? You are going to be in much better shape as a student, and that's a skill that's going to help you no matter what kind of work you do in the future, because you're just being more conscientious and more detail oriented, and those are skills that are really going to pay dividends. So get into that habit now, and it's going to take you through your whole career here at SNU. Yeah, and Jim mentions the difference between the milestone and the final, and that isn't necessarily always the case in every class, that they have milestones and then you have a final product that is just revisions of the milestones, but it is common in some classes. So keep that in mind too, that some will be a lot like this in terms of how they're formatted as a course. So Shay, oh, did your coach like the purses, the handbags? Yeah, there's got to be some people who broke into that market and like, hey, now everyone buys their handbags, spends probably too much money. Like a celebrity, you know, like one of those celebrities from one of those reality TV shows probably started making handbags and selling a bunch of them, I bet. I'm not really a handbag person. Yeah, Patsy, so the electric and gas company, that's interesting. I don't know where that company is, but I know here in where I live, they have these alternate energy suppliers that we can sign up with. So that could be something you could discuss in terms of a new entrant to the market and whether they're successful or not so successful. All right, we are right at 9 o'clock. Yeah, it is challenging, which is certain companies are more challenging than others for this paper, for sure. Yeah, and you know that's part of the reason we have the suggested companies list, not because we want to limit your choice, but we want everyone to be successful. Not that, I mean, and lots of people are super successful with companies not on that list. But those are just the ones that we know are kind of tried and true in terms of being able to find information. Yeah, and you don't have to find a failed one. It's a successful one or a failed one, Shay. So if you're having trouble finding a failed one, it might be easier to find a successful one. You know, like J.Lo made a line of handbags and they sold like hotcakes. I don't know. Who knows? All right. Well, we are 1 minute over, so our 202 students have joined and are waiting for their turn. Thank you all so much for your questions. I really appreciate it and for joining us tonight. And if you have any questions that come up, you can feel free to email me. I'm going to put my email in the chat. But more importantly, if you have questions, especially about your feedback or about your performance in general, those should go directly to your instructor because they're the ones who gave you the feedback and they're the ones that are going to be looking for you to incorporate it in your final draft. So the sooner you can get your questions to your instructor, the sooner you can start working on it. All right, thank you all so much. And welcome 202 folks. We have a few new things to cover. You have 4 new critical elements that we are going to review tonight. So we're going to jump right into it. Yes, macro. Here we go. Okay, so this is the full guide. I'm just going to scroll right up to the top. So this is the full guide for your PowerPoint presentation. Now you have 4 critical elements that you're going to add into your presentation for your final submission. So first I want you to think about how your slides are coming together. So you have your milestone 1, which nicely comes first in your final draft of the presentation. So you have your title slide, you have your tenure overview, you've got your GDP slides or slide, you've got your unemployment and inflation slides, you've got your interest rate slide. And now you'll notice that we've got 2 new slides in here. Foreign trade imports and exports and foreign trade models. You haven't worked on these yet in your milestones because we didn't cover foreign trade until week 6. So now that we've done that work in our textbook and in our discussion, now we can do these slides and include them into our final draft. So when you work on the slides, this is where they're going to fall. They're going to fall right after interest rates. And the first one is on imports and exports, and it's sort of another, for lack of a better term, data dump. So you're going to be getting the data just like you did with interest rates and with unemployment and inflation and with GDP. We've got some links here to one source. This source is not to the Census Bureau, these 2 links here, but to Trading Economics. Some students have had trouble getting their years to come out or getting the data to pull out. You can go directly to the Census Bureau if you're having a difficult time. If you're doing the 50s, sometimes the Census Bureau doesn't go back that far. It's not that the data is not out there, it's just not as easily attainable. So if you're having trouble getting data on imports and exports for the 50s directly from the Census Bureau or from either of these links or from Fred has this data too, but again, I think it didn't go back as far as the links that we shared. Let your instructor know and they can hopefully point you in the right direction. Or you can go directly to the Shapiro Library and they can help you with the 24/7 librarian chat. So those are some options. So, but the first thing you're going to do here is you're going to have a graph of the data. Students generally do levels of imports and exports, so it's in real inflation adjusted dollars. But some students also choose to show it as a percentage of GDP. I think in the earlier decades, showing it as a percentage of GDP is, because it was much smaller then, isn't as telling. So it might make more sense depending on the decade, the choice you want to make. But either is appropriate in terms of what we want to see, because we want to see the trend and how it's moving. So that will help you both. I would recommend to show imports and exports separately instead of showing them as net exports. That way you can see how they move. Are they both increasing, but one's increasing faster than the other? Is one going down and one going up? If you just show net exports, you lose that. So I would recommend that you show both. It'll give you more to talk about, and it will, show your instructor that that you understand what's going on in each of those sectors. And then so you've got your data on your slide, and then you're going to give a brief analysis of the data just to make some connections to other aspects of the economy, like the exchange rate. So obviously the exchange rate does play some role in level of imports and exports. So that's something you can speak to here. And then the next element is going to take it one step further in terms of talking about things that that affect trade. So we're going to look at we're going to apply the models here again. Our well-loved aggregate demand, aggregate supply model is one that you could use again. So if you're feeling really familiar with it and you want to use it again, you could. And an example is outlined here. You could also talk about comparative advantage here. That's one. You could talk about trade policy here as well. That might not technically be a model in the economic sense, but it's certainly something that I think would satisfy this and does feed into the idea of comparative advantage. That's one of the reasons that we reduce trade barriers, so we can take advantage of that, of our comparative advantage. So that does feed into that. So when our leaders, when our lawmakers decide to reduce trade barriers between countries, they're hoping to take advantage of the economic models that say there will be gains from trade. So you can talk about those policies as well, and how reductions in trade barriers, like reductions in quotas or reductions in tariffs, might have impacted trade in your time period. So those are the few of the things you can do here to discuss and satisfy foreign trade models. So Eden asks, do we need to show an aggregate demand, aggregate supply image, or just discuss it? I mean, I think if you're going to discuss a movement in aggregate demand, aggregate supply, it would be helpful to show it, because when you show, like, let's say the aggregate demand curve shifting one way or the other, then you can very clearly state, okay, we see the impact on price level and we see the impact on output. In terms of creating it in PowerPoint, I mean, you're just using the line drawing tools. So you draw the line for your, axes, your vertical axis and your horizontal axis. So just, make them straight and, make one perfectly vertical, and make one perfectly horizontal. And then you're just, having your X, the big old X that we're familiar with. You don't have to necessarily do a curved line. And forgive me, because I've seen so many macro textbooks lately that I forget if our textbook does the straight aggregate demand or the curved aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves. But you'll have those curves, and you're just going to draw the straight lines for aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and then draw another one to show the shift, just like you see in the textbook. It doesn't have to be fancy. It can they're just lines that you're drawing. So yeah, I was pretty sure they were straight. I know that our old textbook that we used many years ago in this course had curved ones. And I was reviewing a textbook that had curved ones, so yeah. So Elizabeth asks, should the model diagram be on the slide or in the speaker notes? It should definitely be on the slide. If you're going to draw a picture of, like with the drawing tools, like draw the lines to show aggregate demand shifting in some way, you want that on your slide. And Eden, to your point, if you want to, I believe it was Eden that asked the first question. If you find an aggregate demand, aggregate supply image that shows the shift that you're looking for and doesn't have anything else on it that you don't want, that, maybe it might say government spending increase and it shows the aggregate demand shift. Obviously, that might not be what you want when you're talking about foreign trade, but if it's nice and clean and it shows the shift that you're looking for, you can borrow it from wherever you find it online, or, in some textbook or some resource, and cite it. That's fine too. As long as it shows what you want it to show. You don't necessarily have to create it yourself. All right, so those are some of the options you have to discuss models, and you can discuss more than one. So if you do want to talk about aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and then you also want to talk about a change in policy that changed, that had an impact on trade, or you want to talk specifically about comparative advantage without necessarily talking about policy, all of those are options that you can use here in any combination and satisfy this critical element. Okie dokie. Let's see, any other questions about that? So we're going to keep scrolling on. So you notice what comes next when you're putting everything together is your fiscal policy stuff. So this was milestone 2. You got your fiscal policy start of the decade or start of your time period, then fiscal policy actions, the actions that were happening throughout, then the impact. And then right from there, we go into your milestone 3, which was monetary policy. That I have an extra slide, don't worry about that. The actions, and then again, the impact. And then this is when we come back to the new stuff. We have 2 additional slides. And these slides are the ones that I think students tend to enjoy the most, or certainly the last one. So this first new slide that you're adding is your kind of conclusions or your summary. So this element, you're going to take everything that you've done. You've got your data, you've got some of your analysis in terms of policy and how events have played a role in shaping the economic landscape of your time period. So you're going to bring all that together and summarize it here. Now, of course, we don't want too much text on the slide, so you want to maybe pull out a few specific data points that are helpful, maybe like, this was peak GDP or this was peak unemployment, or highlight a few events and talk about, or highlight a few policies and talk about their impact on the economy and trends in the economy. Every decade has things that are more important. For one decade, it might be a major shock. For another decade, it might be a major policy change. So it's really up to you what you want to focus on. But as you can see here, we want it to be a general summary and to include some specific data points. So you're going to have the main stuff on the slide and then go into a little bit more detail in the speaker notes like we always do. And then the last one here is your chance to talk about what you think. So this is where I think students tend to have a little bit more fun with things. Now you've looked at a lot of different policies in your work here in this project, because you got to look at fiscal policy over a 10-year time period, and you got to look at monetary policy over a 10-year time period. And so now you get to be sort of Monday morning quarterback and say, hey, well, I thought this was a great idea, but I thought this was a terrible idea, and here's why. Now, the only thing that we ask you is that when you say here's why, is that you give an economic-based reason for here's why. Now, the nice thing is that when it comes to economists, they almost always seem to disagree. I know Bill and Ellen can back me up on this. So it's not that there's necessarily a right or a wrong answer, but more your interpretation of things and also what you prioritize. So somebody might prioritize inflation, someone else might prioritize unemployment. Some people might prioritize stability in the markets, somebody else might prioritize poverty reduction. So there are different things that you could say this was a success or this wasn't a success, or I agree with this or I don't agree with this, depending on what you think is more important. So there is room to disagree or agree with how things went. But just make sure that all of your reasoning is macroeconomic based. Because there might be reasons that you disagree with the policy that have nothing to do with macroeconomics, which is also fine. It's just we're not going to discuss that here in this project since this is your project on macroeconomics. So keep that in mind as you think about those things. You don't necessarily have to go through every single policy. If you covered a lot of different policies, maybe you just might want to talk about a couple of the most important ones. If you only did cover one or two in each fiscal and monetary policy, then maybe you want to speak to both. And sometimes they go together. So fiscal and monetary policy might have been working together to overcome a recession, for instance. And maybe you speak to those collectively. So try to be somewhat comprehensive here, but it's not that you necessarily have to go through the list one by one if you covered a lot of individual policies, but more broadly be comprehensive in your interpretation of whether you agree or disagree with the actions that were taken. Yep, and Ellen brings up a great point, and this is highlighted in the rubric, is you can justify this with research. So you did a little bit of this probably already on your impact slides. So where you were encouraged to look at research on the impact of some of these policies. So you can leverage that to talk about your agreement or disagreement with it. So if you looked at the research and the research says that, oh, this policy was successful in doing X, Y, but not Z, then that can maybe inform your opinion of if you think it was a good choice or not. Maybe you thought Z was really important, so you didn't think this was such a great policy decision. Or maybe you thought, hey, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. This was a great policy decision. So you can definitely leverage that and look for more research to bolster your opinion here in this section. And those are the 4 that we need to add. So that's it. I don't see a ton of questions. So if there aren't any questions, what I want to do is just briefly go over the rubric and talk about some of the differences there between the milestone. Okay, thought I maybe saw somebody typing, but great, okay. All right, well then let's jump over there. All right, bear with me. Here we are, okay. So we've already looked at this document, and hopefully you all have too on your own. But this is the entire project document that describes what you're doing, has your full outline, which is here, has the milestone breakdowns, which we've already done, and then gets into the rubric itself. So this rubric, hopefully you're all familiar with it by now. Not necessarily this rubric, but how it's set up in general. So you've got all of the elements on which you're graded on your left-hand side. And then we have these different performance levels and the descriptors for each one. So the big difference here that I want to highlight and make sure everybody really understands is that because you've had a chance to revise all of this work, based on your instructor's feedback, based on the knowledge that you've gained throughout the term, based on having more time to work on it, the goalposts have sort of been extended. So we hope to see a slightly higher level of performance here, which is why we now have an exemplary column. So from your milestones, there was only proficient, needs improvement, and not evident. And so if you got a perfect grade on your milestone, you could have been that you were just at the proficient level, which is now only considered a B. You might have already been at the exemplary level on the milestone, but it's possible that you were at the proficient level, but you still got full credit. Because in the milestone, that was considered the highest performance we were expecting at that point in the course. Now we're expecting a little bit more. So I want to highlight this so that you really take care when you read your feedback. So if you got needs improvement on any element in your milestone, that was worth 75% of, whatever point value it was for that particular critical element. You got 75% of it. But you'll notice that now a needs improvement is a 55%. So you've gone from sort of earning a C on that particular element to earning a failing grade on that particular element. So it's really important that if you want to make sure that you're successful on your final draft, that you address especially those needs improvements, because you really want to bump them up to proficient and make sure that you incorporate your instructor's feedback in order to get there. And then in doing so, you might get all the way up to exemplary for the final, which is awesome and absolutely doable. But you'll notice that there's a pretty big jump. So we go from 55% here in needs improvement, which is, again, a failing grade, to a proficient. So if you make sure that you take all of your needs improvements and get them into proficients for your final draft, you're going to have a B, which is, something to be happy about, in my opinion. This is a challenging assignment. And anything that you move up to exemplary will get you or earn you full points for that critical element, which will bring you closer to an A if that's your goal for the course. So really make sure that you first tackle any needs improvements that you got on your milestones. You should have gotten some detailed feedback from your instructor on those. If you got any proficients on your milestones, that could mean one of two things. And this is where, again, interpreting your instructor's feedback is really important, and reading the rubric is really important. So if you got a proficient, that might mean that you're just truly at proficient, but you're not at exemplary yet. And ideally, your instructor gave you some feedback about how to go from proficient to exemplary for the final draft. They might not have called it out specifically in those terms, but they might have said, hey, you did a really good job. I'd like to see you add this, or I'd like to see you go into a little bit more detail. I don't want anyone to misinterpret that as a suggestion, but say, hey, I got full credit on this element, so I don't have to make a change, even though my instructor said to add more detail. Maybe they were just trying to get me to work harder. They do want you to work harder, but it's also going to have an impact on your grade. So I just want to make sure that's very clear to everybody. Now, sometimes in your milestones, you'll earn proficient, but you'll already have done exemplary work. And in those cases, your instructor might say something to you along the lines of, this is fantastic work. I love what you've done here. You don't need to make any changes. And in those, you're done, and you can just sort of put those off to the side and focus on some other elements that might need a little bit more attention. So those are sort of the three things that could be happening. And then, of course, if you missed any elements, you might have gotten a not evident. So you just would start from scratch on those. Oh, I missed that one. Maybe you forgot to talk about inflation or something. That happens sometimes, or some students forget to talk about interest rates on milestone 1. No big deal. You just, you would go in and read the guide and see how to tackle it, and just go and do it and give it your best shot if you got a not evident anywhere. So it's really important that you take your instructor's feedback, you take your work, and then you look at the rubric here, this final project rubric, and try to place where you are and how to get where you want to go, using all that information together. So the rubric is sort of the be-all, end-all of how you ought to be graded, and your instructor's feedback is there to give you suggestions of how to meet these rubric requirements. All right, I see some action in the chat. All right, so Manik had asked about monetary policy. Thank you, Ellen, for reviewing that. All right, Lee F. I'm sorry to hear that you're struggling in the course. It can be difficult. What time period are you doing, Lee? The 80s. So yeah, the 80s saw, with Reaganomics, they saw a lot of changes to tax policy. So that was a big one there. And that played a major role. We heard a lot about when trade started to start increasing after sort of China was opened up in the 70s, and then things really started to get going then. So there's a lot going on there. And because of the Reagan Revolution, as Ellen put it, there is a lot of research out there on it. So it might just be a matter of, honestly, if I were you, because Reagan was, he was president, because he was 2 terms, just to feel more comfortable with understanding it, go to his Wikipedia page for Ronald Reagan, and there's a huge, long section on his economic policy. And that might give you a nice bird's eye view of how things were at that time. I'm not saying you can cite Wikipedia. Doesn't mean you can't read Wikipedia. Wikipedia can be a great jumping off point for finding excellent academic research. And I encourage students to go there and read and educate yourself. Should you trust every little thing you see on Wikipedia? Maybe not necessarily, but for the most part, I find that for these things, it's generally reliable. And then they've got links to academic papers and, government research, like the White House database or the Congressional Budget Office, and a lot of these things that are primary research. They're the legit sources for information. So Wikipedia is a nice place to start, and then you can jump off from there. And then if you read the page, you just have a good general understanding. And then when you go to look at those links provided in Wikipedia, you'll have some basis for understanding it all. Yeah, I don't want to see students citing Wikipedia, certainly, but I absolutely think it's a great way to start your own understanding of something and to find research. I find lots of research in Wikipedia, and then at the bottom they've got all their notes, and a lot of them are hyperlinked if they're available online, and then you can follow them there. If you find something like a source that's cited in a Wikipedia article, but it's not hyperlinked, you might be able to find it through Shapiro Library. So you can just get the title of whatever it is. Maybe it's some sort of academic paper, and you can go to the Shapiro Library and see if they have it. Yeah, so Amanda, thank you so much for sharing that. So the thing that Amanda shared, I might not necessarily want my students to cite that either. I haven't looked at it, but it might be a little not very academic, so to speak, but it's a good place to start for you to understand and might have some good links to more proper academic sources. Yeah, Carissa, that's a great example. Thank you so much. So Carissa says, for those listening at home who maybe can't follow the chat, that she used Wikipedia to help her find the names of policies, and then she could research those specific policies. So that's a great one too. Thank you for that suggestion. Yep. And Lee, if you go to that on Reaganomics, that's going to happen. I mean, it's a very long section because the economics at that time was just a big sea change. And so they go into a lot of detail, and there's a lot of action in terms of fiscal policy. So they're going to give the names of all those policies throughout the time period, and then you can do some research from there. Elizabeth, I know that there were 2 recessions in that time period. Obviously, the Great Recession happened between 2000 and 2010. And there was the earlier recession after sort of the dot-com burst. So I think if focusing on kind of those 2 humps, or I shouldn't say humps, those 2 bumps, is generally enough for students to do a pretty good job in terms of looking at policy and looking at events. So, the first recession, we had a bit of like the dot-com burst and then 9/11. So that all played into that. And then obviously the financial and housing crisis for the Great Recession. So. Yeah, a lot of, Lee mentioned the 90s. A lot of students I've found don't like doing the 90s because it was kind of just like almost too smooth sailing, and they didn't have enough to talk about. There's always stuff to talk about, but I think some students are like, oh, where's my big recession to talk about? Yeah, we could all use a little 90s right now. I'm a child of the 90s, so I always miss the 90s. Oh, Manika, you're not screwed. I hope I can say that on this webinar recording. No, it's 3 slides usually, maybe a few more than 3 slides, but it's 3 critical elements. Nothing you can't make up. You've got the 4 new ones to add here, but the last 2 are sort of summarizing. So really you're only looking at the monetary policy stuff and the trade stuff as new things that you have to bring in. So you'll be able to get it done. Eden, you can certainly post in the general discussion board. I mean, I haven't had students take advantage of that. They probably assume that it's not allowed. If you post there and, someone's like, oh, I found this great resource, just like we've been doing here, I can't see that as anything bad. I don't think we want you sharing each other's slides, but if you say, hey, I found this great resource that might help you with the issue you're having, me as an instructor, I would think that's awesome. So if you're worried, you can always ask your faculty member first, but you could just post in the general questions area and see if other students chime in. Yep, great suggestion, Ellen. So yeah, you can find out others in your class who did the same time period. Yeah, Jackie, it's really not that much to add. I mean, the last two slides are more retrospective on what you've already done, and the foreign trade stuff is just a couple of things. So getting the graphs should be pretty easy, and talking about them in terms of things like exchange rates and then any of the models shouldn't take a terrible amount of time. And ideally, you've already looked at some of that stuff from your discussion in week 6, which is about foreign trade, and you looked at some of the policies and maybe some comparative advantage stuff there already. So we were hoping to leverage that a little bit so you didn't have to start totally from scratch for those 2 slides. All right, we are a couple minutes over, which is fine. If there are more questions, please feel free to post them up. We've covered the things that I want to cover, so I'm happy to take questions until everyone's got all their questions out. No, Jackie, don't beat yourself up. We all do it, but there's time, so you've got many days. All right, I see a few people typing, so I just want to make sure there's no more questions before we sign off and say goodnight. You're very welcome, Elizabeth. Glad you could make it. I agree, Ellen. All right, you're welcome, everyone. And one last bit, if we sign off tonight and 5 minutes from now you're like, oh my God, I have this really, really burning question, email your instructor straight away. The earlier the better, or post in your general discussion forum in the class if you think it's something that everybody could help you with. Also, if you have any questions about any feedback you've received, you don't understand it, you don't understand if you need to make a change, you don't understand how to incorporate what they've told you to incorporate, anything like that, the sooner you can contact your instructor about it to get some clarification, the better, because then that will just give you more time to turn it around. So if that's something that you think you're going to need to do, I would set aside some time, tonight late, but maybe tomorrow to go through that and send any questions you have to your instructor, and then they'll get them to you before the weekend, and you'll have the weekend to work on it. Thanks, Amanda. Again, such great resources. Do we have that one anywhere in our class, Ellen? That link to the New York Fed? Or is that a new one? We have so many Fed links. I learned about a new Fred game when I went to an econ conference over the weekend, and it's called Fred Cast, and it's students or any group of people can make an account free, and you forecast 4 indicators. So it's 4 measurements. It's GDP for the quarter, employment, payroll for the month, unemployment for the month, and inflation for the month. So that they're due by the 20th of the given month that you're forecasting for. And then however close you are, you earn points, and they have this whole leaderboard. It's so cool. And I want to see if any of our maybe upper level courses where they do forecasting, we could incorporate that. Yes, thank you, Kathy and Amanda. Yeah, the San Francisco Fed, yeah, they do a lot of research papers. So that's a good one if you sort of want to dig a little deeper to understand something. Yeah. Yeah, so much great resources from them as a group. They must have a lot of people working for them. And Bill or Ellen, have you guys ever heard of C-Tree? It's another conference for economic education. The letter C and then tree, T-R-E-E. So C-T-R-E-E, yeah. Everyone was talking about it at the conference I was at. We should all make a plan to go, a little econ vacation. I think it's put on by AEA along with the Fed, I want to say, or along with the Journal of Economic Education or something. Well, probably not courtesy of SNU. Yeah. I wish. But yeah, I learn a lot about a lot of these great tools to share with students at these conferences. So yeah, I'm glad to come back and share it with you all. Eden, you know, I think it's one of those things that whenever you're with sort of like-minded people, people who speak your same language, you just feels fun.